Are you ready, kids?
Hello, it's Employee a Million, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today's episode is Season 4, Episode 3, or Episode 63 overall. Have You Seen the Snail? It originally aired on November 11th, 2005, and was written by Aaron Springer and Paul Tibbett. And this is the first half-hour special of Season 4. There were two in this season, and I think both of them were absolutely amazing. I think, for all its faults, Season 4 is probably the very best season of SpongeBob for specials, because Dunces and Dragons later in the year is also a banger. But for now, we've got Have You Seen the Snail? And here's where you can see the guest stars for the average SpongeBob episode are getting a bit more celebrity-y. There's the special guest voice of Amy Poehler, but you have got a more obscure act doing some of the music for this. Alt rocker Stu, the Mark Stewart, just a Mark Stewart, who performs Gary Come Home later in the episode. So they're still keeping true to some of the show's alt rocker, inspirations for its background music, which I really appreciate. And this episode was seriously hyped up before its release. Like this was probably the biggest campaign for a single episode yet. It was called Where's Gary in advertisements, which is the name of another song performed at the end of this episode in the credits. But I don't like that name as much as Have You Seen the Snail, because Where's Gary seems like it's about hide and seek or something. Whereas Have You Seen the Snail tells you a bit more about, the struggle of trying to find a lost pet, which SpongeBob goes through in this episode. But marketing was pretty big. It was treated like a huge announcement, something to look forward to at the end of the year for SpongeBob's first year back on TV. Even though it was really early in the year, they pushed it back to November and let most of the early part of Season 4 air first. And I think that was an okay idea, but Nickelodeon's summer that year was absolutely packed, and I think that SpongeBob could have been... this special could have really slipped into that, big time of year for Nickelodeon. But I guess in November you've got better ratings, whereas in the summer most kids are out, doing things and off at camp or something. That's why ratings usually dip in the summer, and network TV usually goes from autumn to spring and then takes a break in summer. But regardless of when exactly this episode could have aired, it did pretty well ratings-wise. It got around 7 to 8 million viewers, which I think this was the highest rated SpongeBob episode at the time, until it was beaten by either Dunces and Dragons or Atlantis Squarepantis. So yeah, SpongeBob hype was still real after the movie. People still wanted to see more of this character and this world, and it's quite innocent still at this point sense of humor. And I guess the marketing team knew that too, because this released on VHS and DVD only 4 days after it aired, alongside some other Season 4 episodes. And that's really strange to think that, there were Season 4 episodes still being shown and released on VHS. You think of VHS as having died out by this point, but no, they kept it around just for the lower end consumers who hadn't switched to DVD yet or couldn't switch for one reason or another. And the songs were then featured on albums. The Yellow Album only came out 4 days also after this episode aired, and that had Gary Come Home on it. And the credit song Where's Gary was then featured on the Best Day Ever album, which is a much more snug home for that episode. But I think the most stunning bit of promotion this episode got, whether it was made in jest or not, was that Cartoon Network would have a little cartoon snail crawl across the bottom of the screen the week this aired, with a little sign saying, I Heart Cartoon Network. And there are clips online of this little cartoon snail, just slithering across reruns of like Dexter's Lab and Foster's and stuff. And like there was no coincidence. It was a cartoon snail. There was a big special on Nickelodeon that week about a cartoon snail in the biggest kids show at the time. It had to be like a jab at Nick, and I really do miss when companies, whether they be for video games or animation or film, would just take digs like that at their competitors. So I think that's really funny and probably didn't help Cartoon Network because their ratings have never been quite as good as Nickelodeon's. And this episode has like a strong legacy within the show itself because according to Tim Hill in an interview, it was used as the basis for Sponge on the Run. You know, that episode had a lot of bases, to be completely frank, but this is the clearest one. You know, Gary's gone missing, SpongeBob and Patrick, you know, adventure to find him. This is a bit more small scale. Sponge on the Run is just this big, messy movie, so I vastly prefer this. But I do find it interesting that Tim Hill even said in that interview that Steven Hillenburg, when he was around during like the early development of Sponge on the Run, when It's a Wonderful Sponge, he wanted to springboard off of that idea for the movie. That's his exact words for like how they came to like the missing Gary angle for Sponge on the Run. So that's reassuring that this episode had Steven's seal of approval in some capacity. But yeah, I don't know if he like had any favorite post-movie episodes. I mean, let's not ask him. He deserves his privacy. He's dead now. But I really like this episode. It got some mixed reviews at the time that like one was quite positive of the more emotional punch this episode offered, and one was more critical of it. And there are a few fans out there that don't really like how emotional this is, don't think that it quite fits the brand of the show. But I think for like a half-hour special that wants to like dabble in something heartbreaking, like you know, a pet going missing. It's nothing too sad, but something that can happen in real life to kids that, you know, they would have to like learn to cope with. I think that this episode does a really good job of like doing that. It's not like a completely unfunny episode all about this super serious tone, because this episode is hilarious, trust me. Like the animation in it is great. There's a lot of wacky little moments, and I'm just really impressed by how funny this episode is and how it doesn't overshadow the, you know, emotional core of the episode, really. Like, and how the emotional core of the episode doesn't overshadow the humor. It's got this really good balance to it where, you know, they know exactly when to switch from sad to happy slash funny. And Gary going missing isn't the only thing they treat like a super serious thing. That's another good thing. They also have Patrick having to part ways with his sentient pine cones, which is a joke, but does show that there is place for gravitas in this world, even if it isn't a focus of a story. That, you know, heartbreak can happen, even if it's conveyed through a joke. But I think like a big point of contention, even for me sometimes, is the opening of this episode where SpongeBob's too busy with his toy to like feed Gary, and how, with how much SpongeBob loves his Gare Bear, that's kind of an odd way to sort of show him neglecting Gary in order to prove that he loves him later on through his reactions throughout this episode. It's kind of weird, but it is a Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy toy approved by Nickelodeon that he gets sucked up in. And I can totally buy that he like gets wrapped up in one of his other favorite things and forgets something a little more important. I think that is something relatable that, you know, can happen to some, you know, people with short attention spans or things. And I do really like that it's a Nickelodeon branded product because, in the 90s, aside from TV, they were also well known for making a lot of really weird toys like moon shoes and like glow in the dark thingy majiggies and really weird looking clocks. These very bizarre kids' toys. So I do really like how that was sort of alluded to in the show, like the little Viacom jab in Meme Man 5. But yeah, I think there is a bit of justification for the way SpongeBob acts at the start of this episode. And I think that, his grief throughout the rest of it and just his fear that something horrible might be happening to Gary and all the lengths that he goes to in order to get his attention, I think that smoothens things out. Like by the end, you've kind of forgotten the oddly childish reason that Gary's gone away in the first place. And Gary himself, I think that this episode has a really good handle on Gary's character. Like in a lot of post movie episodes, it's sort of like he's got a bit too much characterization to the point that he's a much better main character than SpongeBob at points. But here, he's still like a pet with pet like emotions and, motivations and things that he wants, just some food. But they do add a few more anthropomorphic touches to his character, like, him putting on his bib, which is a pretty funny little iconic moment, and him going inside his shell to check his literal body clock is pretty fun. But overall, this is still an episode where Gary is adopted for most of it, so it's not like he's out on his own for very long. I think that if he was out on his own for the entire thing, then that would have just been too sad. But no, it's about what if Gary was like taken care of by this old lady who, is a bit dotty and weird and looks a bit deceiving at the start with like the shadowy silhouette POV, but then turns out to be nice. But then, it turns out that she isn't very nice to snails, apparently. I do really like that twist, but Amy Poehler as the grandma, like, I don't mind Amy Poehler. I don't know if she's done anything super wrong, so that's always something you have to think about with a celebrity these days, but it can sometimes play a factor. But, and like, she was like in her 30s, I think, when this episode aired, so odd choice for like a grandma, but if more celebrities wanted to be on SpongeBob now that it was like a hot TV empire, I think it would have been cool if they like just gave them these very weird, unfitting roles and just asked them to like broaden their voice acting horizons. Like that would be cool. And there's the hat store from My Pretty Seahorse. It doesn't look exactly the same. Maybe they've franchised. Good for them. But yeah, I do really like the choice to like make this like this big adventure and do it, not make it the very first thing to air after the movie because, would probably need some time to adjust back to a regular SpongeBob world. But also, I really do appreciate the risk they took in making this a half-hour episode, a full 22 minutes of just SpongeBob animation, because the first SpongeBob movie did prove that SpongeBob can work in longer formats if everything is like clicking like a machine and everything just has a point and a purpose to it. And yeah, most of Have You Seen the Snail is like that too. Like, it really does feel like they wanted to do a lot with this episode and, make it as big of a deal to themselves as it would be to the network and the fans of the show. And it's also a pretty big risk because even though there were specials in the pre-movie seasons, they all had patchy segments, like even Shanghai, which was like a fair bit longer than the average 11-minute episode was still packaged as a special and still, you know, branded with Patchy all over it, even after it was later repackaged with Gary Takes a Bath. But here, you don't really need to think of Patchy segments. You don't have to go through all the effort of thinking of a gimmick for Patchy to go through with Potty or something. And that's another thing. Steven Hillenberg has left the voice acting scene as well, so for the next couple appearances, Potty is played by Paul Tibbett, and he does a fine job, but yeah, there were a few weird factors that led to them not bringing Patchy back in season 4, and that's another reason that's my favorite season for specials. Like, he still appeared in, like, advertising for this episode. He's always going to be around for advertising SpongeBob specials, at least for, you know, the early to middle era of the show. So, yeah, I'm happy with them sort of experimenting with, you know, this is just a full-on SpongeBob special. This is what people want to see out of SpongeBob. This is, okay, we've got them by the seat of their pants with, like, the more emotional moments in the movie. Now let's see if we can do that in a half-hour format, which is something that we haven't really done before in full 2D animation. And to its credit, the animation in this episode is quite interesting and cool in very weird ways. Like, for the first 2/3 of the episode, SpongeBob's model is kind of strange. Like, for the first act, it's his, like, regular season 2 or 3 look. Then for the middle portion of the episode, it's his early season 4 look with the button cheek and the eyebrows. And then for the rest of the episode, it's like, whatever. Like, SpongeBob just looks a teeny bit more unhinged and unrefined in a lot of scenes later in this episode, like when he drops the Office products on Patrick. And I really do kind of like that, how, you know, they're wacky faces, but they aren't telegraphing it to you as much as they do now. It's just sort of letting a nice little piece of animation breathe. But you can also kind of start to see that without writers like C.H. Greenblatt and Meriwether Williams to, like, you know, keep the whole SpongeBob operation, you know, looking neat and the same, that Aaron Springer's, like, tendencies as an artist were going to start overtaking the show soon, like the less appealing, you know, cheek shape and the generally less appealing fish designs. Not too bad yet, because those just apply to Grandma, who isn't meant to be that appealing. But by the time you get to, like, season 5 and 6 and they're giving SpongeBob those super big red puffy cheeks, it just does not look right on the character, honestly. But, I mean, I do still really think that Aaron Springer adds a lot to the show whenever he's on it, and I'm happy that this was his first episode back. Kind of proves that he does care about these characters. And another very fun thing about the animation in this episode is that I don't know if I ever noticed it before in the earlier seasons, but I like how for some of these boatmobiles on the street, some of them are submarines, not just the bus. And that's a really cool little detail, like, make more, you know, boat or marine vehicle designs into things that fish can drive. I don't know what kind of humans are small enough to operate those, because, you know, fish are supposed to be taking stuff from our world and reappropriating it for the ocean. That's the lore behind, you know, the building designs and all that. But it is a really nice little detail, and I do really like some of the small things in the design for this episode, like all the different looking SpongeBob photos when he's looking over his photo album with Gary, and the sort of, you know, the weird little knickknacks that the grandma has, like this sort of weird gnome ornament in her kitchen. I'm just gonna put that in the thumbnail for the video just to mess with you guys. But yeah, I do really think that this episode has a style of its own in a way, and that's really cool to see. And this is an oddly dark place to take the episode, but how many times for the next couple seasons are you going to see me or hear me say this is an oddly dark direction? But, for a special, yeah, I can kind of see why they wanted to do this. We were just past the movie, and, that was pretty dark in places too. And this is not as extreme as the movie, but you still have this very Hansel and Gretel-esque twist that the grandma might just want to fatten Gary up, but either out of neglect or because she wants to do something with him and his shell. And I think it gives Gary a chance to be a hero, but there is a bit of a twist to it in that he kind of just takes this random, alley snail and, makes them the new victim. And I think that joke would have worked better if the alley snails actually did something bad to Gary before, but otherwise it just seems like a very one note, you know, yeah, not very satisfying. But either way, it's the end of the episode, and there's a definitely a more poignant part to look at. One last little bit of information that I wanted to talk about is that this episode is featured in the 2007 Alvin and the Chipmunks movie. It's the intro I remember, and the little bit where Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob are talking in the kitchen, when, Mr. Krabs is noticing how sad SpongeBob is and how that's affecting business, which I completely talked over. But yeah, Tim Hill was still working on the show at this point, and he was the director for that godforsaken Alvin and the Chipmunks movie, and I just thought that was a weird little fun fact. I can understand why they picked this of all episodes, because it is a great episode. I really do like it, and it's all worth it for this little bit at the end where SpongeBob can't seem to notice that Gary has come back to him. It's really nice, because with a lot of Gary episodes, you don't usually get the sense that SpongeBob's learned his lesson and Gary suffers something another day. But here, seems really nice. It's really satisfying ending to the episode, and that's what this episode deserved. A really satisfying little hearty moment between SpongeBob and his snail, and just something to put you in a good mood at the very end, with a teeny tiny twist that doesn't matter much. But that was Have You Seen the Snail? Last week, for question time, it was which SpongeBob character would you like to see thrown in jail? And Bryce Fawn says definitely Mr. Krabs, Sparkling with Nights, probably Patrick and Krabs, and Dashel777, I would have to say Patrick, although Mr. Krabs is worse. Mr. Krabs a lot of times got what he deserved. And I kind of agree, but it is relieving to see that even at this point in the series, we've seen Patrick in prison more than once. So, yeah, I do think that they get what they deserve sometimes. But my question time for you is, what was the best season for specials? Because I think season 4, but, there could be an argument for season 2, because there's only really 1 or 2 of them, and they aren't really, specials either, besides Christmas Who. But I'd like to hear what you think is the best for specials. Next week, the last week of this big early season 4 May, we've got some Insanity for Squidward and Skill Crane and Good Neighbors. Goodbye for now.